The smell of saffron and brown butter never really leaves you. It clings to your hair, your uniform, the inside of your wrists, where the cuffs of your sleeves end. Cecily Marsh had learned to stop noticing it sometime around month 3 at Orel. The way you stop noticing the hum of a refrigerator until the power goes out and the silence is suddenly enormous. Orel occupied the 14th floor of the Hargrove Tower in Midtown Manhattan, which meant that on clear nights you could see the Hudson going silver in the distance, and on rainy ones the city dissolved into something soft and unrecognizable below the windows. The dining room held 32 covers, never more, and the waiting list ran 8 months on a slow season. The chef, a Swiss-trained perfectionist named Edouard Vane, ran the kitchen like a research laboratory. The food was precise, architectural, occasionally moving. A single dish could take 4 years to develop. The sommelier, a quiet Belgian named Pieter, knew the name of every winemaker in Burgundy's Côte de Nuit personally and could identify a vintage by smell alone. The linens were changed between every course. Every course. And yet none of that was what people came for, not really. They came because Orel was the kind of place where you were seen. Where the right reservation said something about who you were, where you could conduct the performance of your life at the highest possible register. Cecily had understood that from her first shift. She had also understood, quickly and without bitterness, that she was part of the set design. She was 28. She had been at Orel for 11 months, long enough to know that table 7 by the east window was always reserved for the Alderton family on the 3rd Friday of each month, that the gentleman in finance, who came on Tuesdays, always ordered the quail, and then complained about it, and that the people most likely to leave a generous tip were almost never the ones who arrived wearing the most expensive watches. She had not planned to be a server. That is not a sentence that requires explanation to anyone who has ever needed money urgently and found that their hands were quick and their memory was good. Cecily had been 18 months from completing her doctorate in comparative linguistics at Columbia when her mother was diagnosed. The timeline of a diagnosis like that, stage 3, aggressive, does something to the way you think about time. It collapses it. The 5 years it would take to finish her degree became an abstraction. The cost of her mother's treatment became very, very concrete. She had taken the job at Orel on the recommendation of a friend who said the money was extraordinary for someone with her composure. The friend had been right. Cecily had a particular quality that is difficult to manufacture and impossible to fake, a kind of stillness under pressure that made guests feel both attended to and unhurried. Edouard had noticed it during her trial service and offered her a permanent position before the shift ended. Her mother, 2 years into remission now, sometimes asked when she was going back to school. Cecily always said soon. She had gotten good at saying it with conviction. On a Wednesday in November, Table 11 was assigned to a party of 3 who had made their reservation through a corporate account registered to a company called Viridian Capital Group. Cecily had looked it up once, idly, after a particularly memorable group from the same account. Investment fund, mid-size, the kind of operation that moved money between places in ways that were technically legal and morally creative. The first to arrive was a woman in her 40s named Dorothea Strell, who came in wearing a charcoal blazer and the expression of someone who had been in back-to-back meetings since 6 in the morning and was not finished being professional. She asked for still water and a menu, and she studied the menu the way lawyers study documents, quickly and without pleasure. The second was a man named Harwick Fenn, late 50s, silver-haired, built like someone who had played rugby in college and never quite let go of the posture. He arrived 8 minutes later, greeted Dorothea, with the clipped warmth of a long-time professional acquaintance, and asked Cecily, without looking at her, whether Orel had changed its wine program recently. Cecily said they had brought on 3 new producers from the southern Rhone since spring. Howick made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite dismissal. He sat down and adjusted his cuffs. The third arrived 14 minutes after the reservation time, and his name was Pendleton Cross. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, with the particular confidence of someone who had spent decades in rooms where his opinion was the most important one. He wore a navy suit that cost more than Cecily made in a month, and carried himself through the dining room as though Orel itself had arranged its geography for his convenience. He greeted the table with the expansive ease of a man who had not once waited for a table in his life. Cecily introduced herself and offered the evening's tasting menu. Pendleton looked at her for the first time. Not a long look, just a cataloguing glance, the kind that classifies and dismisses in the same motion. "We'll do the full tasting," he said, "and I want to talk to your sommelier about the Burgundy list before we order wine." "Of course," Cecily said. "I'll send Peter over." She moved away from the table. She noted, as she always noted, the particular quality of not being acknowledged when you leave a room. It was different from not being seen. It was more specific than that. It was being seen, categorized, and then elected out of attention as a deliberate act. She had a name for it in her head, a German word she had learned in her second year of graduate school. Entgegenstellung, the act of placing someone in opposition to yourself in order to render them irrelevant. She brought the bread course. She brought the amuse-bouche, a single spoonful of compressed cucumber, with yuzu cream and a fragment of edible silver leaf, which Hawick admired and Dorothea ate quickly, and Pendleton moved aside without tasting. She brought the first course, a chawanmushi with black truffle and dashi gel. Table 11 was, from the first, a working dinner. Documents were consulted on phones. Numbers were referenced in shorthand. Dorothea took notes on a slim leather portfolio. The conversation was conducted at a volume low enough that Cecily could not have followed it from a normal service distance, even if she had wanted to. She did not want to. She was managing tables 8, 9, and 11 simultaneously. And table 8 had a guest with a shellfish allergy that required coordination with the kitchen, and table 9 had a couple celebrating an anniversary who wanted a surprise dessert with a candle, and there was a rhythm to a service night at Orel that required the same quality of attention as conducting music, the simultaneous awareness of the whole, and the precise focus on the single note. It was during the fourth course, a butter-poached halibut with fennel pollen and preserved lemon, that the night changed. Cecily was at table 8, confirming the shellfish substitution with a gentleman named Roussard, when she became aware that the conversation at table 11 had shifted. Not in volume, in language. She carried the awareness of it back to the service station, with her the way you carry a sound you are not sure you heard. She stood for a moment with her back to the room and her hands on a folded napkin, and let the sound reach her again across the distance. Her grandmother's language coming out of the mouth of Pendleton Cross. Cecily's grandmother, Miriam Adisa, had been born in the Basque country on the French side of the border, in a village the size of a long afternoon, and had spoken Basque as her mother tongue before she spoke French or English. It was not a common language. It was, in fact, one of the most linguistically isolated languages in the world, with no proven relation to any other living tongue. Miriam had spoken it to Cecily as a child, the way some grandmothers teach prayers, quietly and consistently, as a form of inheritance. Cecily had spoken it back. She had eventually written a chapter of her dissertation on the grammatical structures of Basque as a case study in linguistic isolates. She had not heard it spoken by a stranger in her adult life, not once. Pendleton Cross was speaking Basque to Harwick Fenn. Harwick was responding, haltingly, with the careful effort of someone who had learned a language as an adult and used it infrequently. Cecily went very still at the service station. She listened. The particular nature of Basque, its verb-first structure, its system of cases built on ergative-absolutive grammar, meant that a listener who knew it could not half understand it the way you might half understand Italian if you spoke Spanish. You either knew it or you did not. There was no middle space. Cecily knew it. Pendleton was saying, in his crisp, slightly formal Basque, that the girl was fine, that she would not be a problem, that she was decorative and attentive and clearly did not have a thought in her head beyond the table. He was saying it the way people say things about furniture. Abstractly, without malice, because malice implies that the subject of the statement has the capacity to be harmed by it, and he had already decided that she did not. Harwick said something about the halibut being excellent. Pendleton said, returning to his previous subject with the ease of a man discussing weather, that Dorothea had been resistant to the restructuring plan all quarter, but that she would come around once the numbers were presented in the format he intended to present them tomorrow. He said, the format was designed to make certain liabilities look like certain assets. He said the words that meant, in the ergative structure of the language, that the intention was not to deceive the committee, but to guide their attention. Dorothea, who did not speak Basque, was looking at her portfolio. Cecily lifted a bread basket and walked back to table 11. She set the basket down. She refilled Harwick's water glass. She asked Pendleton, in English, whether he would like to hear about the cheese course when they were ready. He said yes, without looking at her. She asked, in Basque, whether he preferred cow's milk or sheep's milk, because the house had an extraordinary idiazabal from the Pyrenees that she thought he might appreciate. The silence that followed was not a dramatic one. It was the silence of a very expensive room absorbing something that had no immediate category. Pendleton's face did not collapse. Men like Pendleton Cross do not have faces that collapse, but something behind his eyes recalibrated, fast and involuntary, the way a clock adjusts after a power interruption. "What did you say?" he asked in English. Cecily answered in Basque. She said, with the grammar of her grandmother's kitchen and the vocabulary of her dissertation chapter, that she had asked about his cheese preference, and that she hoped the question was clear, and that she was happy to repeat it as many times as necessary. Harwick had gone the color of the tablecloth. Dorothea looked up from her portfolio. "I studied at Columbia," Cecily said, returning to English pleasantly, with the warmth she brought to every table. "Comparative linguistics." Basque was a professional interest. It's such an extraordinary language, completely isolated. There is no other language on earth quite like it. May I ask where you learned? Pendleton Cross said nothing. The idiazabal, Cecily continued, as though the answer were irrelevant, is a smoked sheep's milk cheese from Navarre. It pairs beautifully with the quince they're running this week. I'd recommend it, if you're open to it. She left the table. She did not go to the service station. She went directly to the manager's office, where Orel's general manager, a woman named Constandrew, was reviewing the evening's reservation sheet. Cecily knocked twice and entered. She said, quickly and without preamble, that she had overheard a conversation at table 11 in which one of the guests had made statements about a presentation tomorrow that involved what she believed was an intentional misrepresentation of financial data to a board or committee. She said she was not certain of the legal implications. She said she was certain of what she had heard. Constance looked at her for a long moment. "Do you speak Basque?" she said. "My grandmother was from Labord," Cecily said. Constance stood up. She said, "I need you to write down everything you heard, word for word, as accurately as you can right now, before you go back out there. Take the notepad from my desk. I'm going to make a call." Cecily took the notepad. She sat in Constance's chair and wrote in the careful, complete way of someone who had spent years taking linguistic field notes, which is to say, she wrote not just the words but the grammatical structures, the cases, the precise verb forms, because she knew that the difference between he intended to guide their attention and he intended to conceal. The liability was not a matter of interpretation, but of grammatical case, and she wanted there to be no ambiguity about which one Pendleton Cross had used. It took her 9 minutes. She went back out to the floor. She finished service. She brought the cheese course, the idiazabal included, and described each selection with the same attention she brought to every table in the room. She brought the dessert course to table 9, the anniversary couple, and the candle was lit correctly, and the wife cried a little, and her husband held her hand across the white linen. Pendleton Cross left a tip of exactly 15%, which Cecily noted was his way of making a point. She had expected less. The evening ended at 11:43. Cecily helped reset tables 8 and 9. She changed out of her uniform in the staff room and retrieved her coat from her locker. She was almost at the elevator when Constance came out of the office and told her that the call she had made was to the general counsel of the firm that managed Orel's parent company's portfolio, who had in turn made a call to someone he knew at the Securities and Exchange Commission. "They want your written account," Constance said. "They want to talk to you next week. This is entirely your choice. I want to be clear about that." Cecily looked at her coat in her hands. She thought about her mother's treatment schedule, which had ended 2 years ago, and about her dissertation chapter on Basque grammar, which was still saved on a hard drive in the apartment she shared with a roommate in Washington Heights, and about the particular way her grandmother had taught her the verb forms, with the serious attention of someone transmitting something valuable, something that should not be lost. "What's his name?" she asked. "The SEC contact." Constance told her. "Okay," Cecily said. "Yes." She pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. She stepped inside and watched the dining room through the narrowing gap as the doors closed, the polished floors, the low, warm light, the empty tables being cleared by people who would be back tomorrow, doing it again, attending to other people's evenings with the practiced invisibility of the genuinely skilled. The elevator descended. Pendleton Cross, as it turned out, had used the same linguistic strategy at 3 previous dinners, at 3 different establishments over the course of 2 years. He had learned Basque as a young man from a business associate who had described it, apparently, as the perfect code, spoken by fewer than 1 million people worldwide, impossible to fake, useless to any eavesdropper who hadn't grown up in the Pyrenean foothills. He had used it freely, across many tables and many cities, to discuss things he did not wish to be overheard discussing. The presentation he had described to Harwick on the Wednesday evening in November was reviewed by a forensic accounting team at the SEC's request. The discrepancy between the liability classification he had intended to present and the actual classification as determined by the audit was significant enough to constitute securities fraud. The investigation took 8 months. Cecily was deposed twice. She brought her written notes, the grammatical analysis, the precise ergative case constructions she had transcribed in Constance's office while the cheese course was still being plated. The attorneys on the other side had found, with some difficulty, a Basque-speaking interpreter of their own. The interpreter confirmed her transcription, with minor variations that were consistent with regional dialect differences between her grandmother's laboured variety and the more formal register Pendleton had learned. The meaning, the interpreter confirmed, was not in dispute. She was not in the courtroom when the settlement was reached. She was working a Saturday night service at Orel, managing tables 4, 7, and 11, when her phone buzzed twice in her locker in the staff room. She did not check it until after midnight. The text was from Constance. It contained no details. It said only, "It's done." Cecily read it standing at her locker in her street clothes, her uniform folded over her arm, the smell of brown butter and saffron still in her hair. She stood there for a moment in the particular quiet of an emptied restaurant. The ventilation system running, the kitchen going through its nightly shutdown sequence, someone running a mop over the tile floors of the service corridor. She thought about her grandmother, about the way Miriam had taught her the verb forms by drilling them at the kitchen table, using small household objects as props, the salt shaker, the sugar bowl, the ceramic rooster that sat on the windowsill. About the way her grandmother had said, more than once, that a language was not a decoration, that it was a way of knowing the world differently than someone who did not have it, and that this difference was neither small nor accidental. She put her phone in her pocket. She went back to Columbia the following September. The department had kept her file. Her dissertation committee, which had been reorganized once in her absence, reviewed her existing chapters and determined that she had completed enough work to resume at the ABD stage. Her chapter on Basque grammar, the one she had written in her grandmother's kitchen the summer she was 23, was, her advisor said, still the strongest thing she had submitted. There would need to be updates, revisions, new scholarship to account for. The fieldwork component would need to be revisited. She was not afraid of the work. She had never been afraid of the work. She kept 2 shifts a week at Orel, not because she needed to, but because Constance had asked her to, and because there was something she had not been willing to name until recently. A genuine pleasure in the craft of it, the reading of a room, the timing, the particular satisfaction of an evening that ran without error, where every guest left feeling that something had been done well on their behalf by someone who knew what they were doing. Her grandmother had worked in a hotel kitchen in Lyon for 11 years before she came to America. She had never apologized for it. She had never called it beneath her. She had called it work, which she said was never nothing, and which she said, in Basque, using the absolutive case because the work itself was the subject, always told you something true about who you were when you were doing it. Cecily had written that sentence down once, years ago, in a notebook she still had. She had not understood it completely when she wrote it. She thought she understood it better now.